Today, Peter and I are examining death and rebirth, both as Catholics, that is, sacramentally, and mythologically. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We hope that you've enjoyed all of these podcasts. We're nearing the end here of season 3, and Peter and I are going to be going on to a little break, but that is just because good things are happening, and you'll be seeing more of those good things very soon. So, Peter, I think when we were talking about this podcast, the image that we were throwing around was the death of the old man, the old year, you know, how that's portrayed as an old man he's just making his last few steps. And then the new year, which is ushered in as a child, as a baby. The Romans had an interesting perspective of this, where the god Janus, that's where we get the name January from. It's from the Julian calendar. The god Janus had two faces, one face looking forward and one face looking backwards. So this is a time where really it's ingrained upon us to try to assess where we're at, to look at where we're going, but then to see how we've measured up in the past year. Tell me a little bit about what your perspective is of this new year from a mythological standpoint.
Well, of course, like you were saying, it's something rich in history and ancient tradition, going all the way back to the Romans and, of course, the Greeks and the Egyptians before them. So this practice of observing the end of something old and the beginning of something new is very ingrained, I think, into our minds as humans and as a civilization. And so it's interesting to kind of see, we've come to here, coming at the beginning of 2023, further than civilization has ever gone before. And yet in many ways, of course, we are seeing a lot of the troubles that are affecting society, and the problems and the hurt are very ancient and very old problems that we tend to think of as new problems, but they're not really new. A lot of them are coming, are old illnesses that are arising again and rearing their ugly heads. And so I think that in many ways that kind of gives us some hope that people in past ages have faced a lot of the problems we face today. And so I think it's good as we can take this time as the new year begins to look back and kind of learn from that and say, and have some encouragement that our fathers in the past have had many of these issues before. So it's like you were saying, it's a time of rebirth and looking back, and it's a wonderful time to do it.
Right. Well, when I think about rebirth, I'm immediately, it triggers in my mind, and that's because I have a scene that this is very key in the script that we're working on right now, where baptism is a big part of the rebirth. And you and I have, I think, like, it's a bit of a sticking point between the two of us, not emotionally, but theologically, where the idea of original sin, especially because we baptize babies, and the idea that the reason why we baptize babies is to not just initiate them into the church, but also and recognition of the idea that over us all hangs original sin. And baptism, the rite of baptism, this rebirth, cleanses us from this original sin. But I think you and I have kind of differing points of view on that. Can you explain a little bit of where you're coming from?
Well, I don't know if we have really differing points of view, because I think we'd have to discuss more, and I'd have to get clarification on what your views are. But in the past, I've definitely come along a journey, I think, in my understanding of original sin. And in the past, it was this very much a burning question in me that I didn't really understand how we, as let's say me, born in the year 1997, how I am inherently held responsible for the sin of Adam, who existed at some point in ancient history. In Adam and Eve, their sin leaves a mark on me that then dictates in many ways the actions and the fallings and the shortcomings that I will have as a person. Because we are in our Catholic understanding, we're born with original sin, but then baptism washes that away and makes us new in Christ. And so that I think that as Catholics, we have that very inherent merciful view of God, because God at the beginning of our lives as Catholics at baptism washes away and makes us new. But without that baptism, we have that stain of original sin. And so that was a kind of a burning question in me, and how a merciful God could allow, innocent babies to have a stain of sin on them when they had nothing to do with that sin. And so that was kind of something that it was a big question to me that I really struggled with for a long time. And for me, my resolution in it has always been the sacrifice and the sacrifice of Christ and the incarnation, and him becoming man in order to redeem and elevate our nature to something higher than it would have been without. That concept that we've talked about so many times in the past about, happy fall, the sin of Adam that ends up bringing us closer to God, that Satan thought that he had his grip on us and our nature, and God uses that in order to bring us even closer to him than we would have been without it. And so in that view, it's like that answers the question, and to me, and that, it shows the greatest amount of love that God was able to use that, and it was willing to become one of us in order to make something like that happen. That being said, I think that to me, there's still questions when it comes to the book of Genesis and understanding really what it means. And to me, I've always not always, ever since I've kind of been contemplating these questions, I've been much more of the view of taking Genesis not literally, but taking it much more from a perspective of understanding the greater truths and the deep values that it teaches, and not so much that Adam and Eve were two people that existed at some point in history and did this and this and this, but more understanding what it truly is trying to teach us as something for our salvation, if that makes sense. So I don't know where your stance is on that, but that might be a little bit more of what you're referring to when we kind of disagree on that.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think, okay, first of all, I realized I made a jump that probably isn't completely fair for our audience. I mean, as Catholics, whenever we use the word rebirth, immediately we think about baptism, because we are reborn as members of his church, as his sons and daughters. And so it's a very sacramental parallel to this new year, is the idea of rebirth, being born in the spirit, so to speak. So that's why we immediately think about it, and we should talk about it whenever we're talking about this yearly regeneration. Think about how our rebirth into the church has a fallout effect for the rest of our lives that we must continue to be revisiting. And that's why yearly the church has this renew our baptismal vows. So circling back then to a little bit, can you give me more information? You say that you look literally, you don't look literally, but more figuratively to the deeper truth of Genesis. Can you give me more insight on what that means?
Well, I mean, I think if you just look at the
as it has to do with baptism and original sin. Sorry,
right.
That's a broad question.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that when it comes to Genesis, I believe in what it teaches us and what it means for salvation history. It's true that man has a fallen nature, and that fallen nature came from a rebellion and a disobedience and a distrust of God. And that rebellion, that distrust, that creates a chasm between us and God. And ultimately what that necessitates is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And we are able to breach that chasm through baptism. And so that's, I think, where that correlates for me, is that In Genesis, that chasm between God and man is created, but then God is able to use that to bring us even more tightly knit. And I love that concept of reconciliation. That's also a very important concept as Catholics: reconciliation, going to confession. And I think reconciliation, it comes from Latin words, if I'm not mistaken, but it's this idea of being eyelash to eyelash, reconciliation, being able to be so close to God that you're eyelash to eyelash. And that is a concept that's so beautiful to me, that he was able to use that to become our reconciliation, so that we're closer than ever before. So I think that Genesis is extremely important when it comes to salvation history, and the question mark that is left in Genesis is then answered by the cross and by baptism. Of course, that being said, I don't see Adam or Eve as like two literal figures or two people that actually existed, and more as more for the lessons, if that makes sense.
I get it. Okay, so if I'm going to put the pieces together, the Catholic belief in original sin, where we all have, because of the sin of Adam, a separation from God, and therefore necessitating a need for baptism. And then, of course, the baptism in the Spirit is only made possible by Christ founding the church. And he founds the church in such an amazing way on Calvary and with his apostles. So the need for baptism creates a bit of a problem, because you don't see exactly how, I guess, let me just want to clarify. You don't see exactly how it's fair or how it's possible. I guess those are two different things for me, that we would have original sin because of Adam. And so I'll let you answer that in a second, and you can tell me if I'm off the mark too. But so if that is the problem there, then the problem is solved by saying, okay, well, it's a figurative telling of how we fell from God. It's not literally what this guy called Adam walked, and he was in the garden and he fell from God by sin, and therefore his sin is upon us all. It's a figurative thing where we all have this sin, this part of the sin, and that necessitates us to be baptized. Am I kind of getting the sequence of events right?
Yeah, I think you kind of have the general gist of it. I think for me, if you look at it in that way, where it's like you have this character Adam, who did something that now all of us are being held responsible for, that's not a very fair idea. And to me, I think that's a little bit of a misreading of Genesis. It's a misunderstanding of what Genesis is trying to say. And something that God has always done so beautifully, and he does throughout the Bible, is that he's able to teach us these deep truths in ways that we'll be able to understand them. And so I think it too often, at least for me, if you become fixated on the actual literal translation of what this is saying right here, then that really, it detracts from my understanding of the truth. Because then for me, I get fixated on, why are we, like, Adam to me is like a random person, like Bob, like, why am I being held responsible for Bob's shortcomings? Like, that just doesn't make sense to me. Because like in the word Adam just means man, it's a person. And so Adam can be really a stand-in for any of us, that we have this broken human nature. And so it's not so much, for me, like, it's a better way of looking at it to be not so much fixated on, why am I being punished for something that this random dude did, and more saying, like, Adam is me. I am man. I have this broken human nature that is needing healing, and it needs Christ, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And what I would say to it is, it's not a stumbling block for me personally to think about Adam, some man, being responsible ultimately for like historically speaking, it's not a stumbling block. I don't see how I'm trying to say that if you or I look at the Bible in a different way, I don't necessarily think that they're mutually exclusive options. That I think that I tend to look at the Bible more historically. And although I think there's a lot of times where they are speaking metaphorically in the Bible, I do think that I'm less inclined to kind of say, well, this is more metaphorical, just kind of, the amount of times I do it is probably much less than you. And my default is probably more historical than not. And in the case of Adam, I don't see it as a stumbling block that Adam is responsible for original sin getting ushered into the world. And I'm trying to think about why it's not a stumbling block for me. I guess something that's very apparent is that, and I wanted to talk about this in particular, we don't have any right to demand justice. And it occurred to me specifically after our last podcast where I demanded justice from Pope Francis. Justice in that I said, look, if you're going to laicize Father Frank Pavone, you have to laicize all of the other disobedient priests who are diametrically opposed to church teaching by their political stances. And so I was kind of the rebel demanding justice a little bit, saying that. And it occurred to me afterwards, and it's a thought that's occurred to me already several times, is that I don't have a right to demand it. If I were to demand justice in all things, then I would be the convict myself. I would be condemning myself in the end. So if that's the case, then I don't really have a right to demand, like, oh, well, just because some guy Bob, who was the first man, committed some sin, why does that have a repercussion for me? Because it always occurred to me very intimately that if I was some greater being with less propensity to sin, so to speak, if I was born without original sin, because that guilt that's upon us is really another way to recognize it is concupiscence, a way where we are already attracted towards that which is not good, the not good. We are attracted to miss the mark. So if I was less of that, if I was some other being, some higher form of being, then I wouldn't be me. So then I wouldn't exist. So why would I wish myself out of existence just for some hypothetical reason that I would be better? Well, what if I was some perfect Ottoman that didn't have any feelings at all, like had no free will? Well, that wouldn't be better. So maybe it is very good that I am this lesser, so to speak, being that has this concupiscence that's born under the weight of original sin, because at least I get to be me for whatever good that may or may not be. So go ahead.
I think in many respects, I think I do agree with you in that when you have, the greater that I'm very much on board with this idea that the greater that you have to contend with evil, the greater that you are, So if the person who, if you look at just like folk stories and stories that we love to tell and to hear, we love the heroes that face the greatest evil. So if we were just people who did not have to contend with any kind of adversity or any suffering or any evil in our lives, we would not be we would not be who we are, and we would not be heroes of any type of story. And that's, I think, really what very much what our calling is as God's children, is in many ways to be heroes. And that is, and the respect, not the cartoonish kind of hero where that you might picture, but the understanding of a hero as someone who contends with evil and has to fight it and has to vanquish it. And so if we didn't have those weaknesses and those struggles, we wouldn't have that deep and great calling from God to vanquish evil and to choose the good. And like that, what Yaku was saying, like that idea of free will is extremely important. God can't force us to be good, or he could, but he doesn't want to, because he wants us to be free, and he wants us to choose him out of our love for him rather than any sense of being forced to. And it's a greater act of love when you choose freely. But for me, it's just that
make an act of love. A forced act is not an act of love; it's an act of a slave. It's
mm-hmm.
You have no other choice.
Yeah. But for me, I think it's still a difficult concept, because we have no understanding, we have no idea, and I think you kind of addressed this in what you were saying. We have no idea who we would be if not for original sin. And so it's there, like you were saying, there's no point in getting caught up or fixated on that, trying to figure out and trying to blame God for us having this propensity to evil, this concupiscence. But it's not the same situation, that Adam and Eve are facing. They chose evil out of, in the Bible, they chose evil out of a place of complete, no original sin, no stain of sin on them, and a complete freedom to choose either good or evil. And, today as humans, so many, of course, we take responsibilities for our sins. That's important. Mm-hmm. But so many of us are, we have varying degrees of responsibility and culpability for those sins because of our concupiscence and of the problems that in these deep places of brokenness that we have inside of us. And so it's difficult to kind of think of Adam and Eve as being completely free of that and yet choosing the good, and then everyone else having to suffer because of that. So that's kind of where, yeah.
Question for you. What about, is it difficult for you to visualize the evil one? The angel the dark angel who was cast out of heaven for doing exactly that?
Is it difficult?
Choosing evil, because he's in the exact same, he's before God, no less. So if anything, he's in a even more apparently easy decision to make.
Yeah. I mean, for him, I think it's also important to note that I do think that in many ways, what the Bible teaches is that the decision by Adam and Eve to commit the sin did come from a certain respect, did come from a place of fear, fearing God in some way, and fearing losing a certain status. And I think that ultimately what it comes down to with sin is always associated with fear. And what we get from the Bible as well is that Lucifer, the fallen angel, he chooses to turn away from God out of a sense of pride, and also, I think, a sense of fear. And those two really go hand in hand, to sound a lot like Star Wars here.
So it's not as much of a sticking point for you, like that choice, that the tradition of that choice, which I think is very much backed up by how we can look at the world and we see there is dark spirits at work. That's a big part of both of our art the art that we create. That's a huge part of it. So is it as much of a sticking point for you as you described it, a little bit of a sticking point? And I'm not trying to gotcha. I'm just very curious.
I wouldn't say as much. I mean, because I'm more, I think, more looking towards humanity and humans and what we face and what, and of course we are, affected extremely, very, in this ultimate way by Lucifer's rejection of God, because then that sets into motion the great battle between good and evil. But again, Lucifer being the angel, this high angel, and being face to face with God, those are a mystical and greater acts, are greater levels of being than I think that I really am concerned with trying to figure out.
It's like we're in 3 dimensions. We understand 3-dimensional world,
Mhm.
3-dimensional space. I mean, and if you're considering the angels, I mean, they're probably like at the level of seraphim and the beatific vision, which, of course, the evil one, I think the idea was that he was a seraphim, the highest members of the heavenly choir. You're at probably the 10th, the 11th, maybe the 13th dimensions, whatever the highest level of dimensions are, that's the level you're at. So we can't even comprehend every aspects of all the decision. But I didn't pull it out of a hat. The reason why I asked it is because I was thinking very at this time of new year, and I know we have to go because you need to get on. You're doing some important work tonight. So I'll close with this. At this time of new year, the very idea of time should come, we should consider it. What is time? Because for someone like an angel, time doesn't exist. At least that's how we understand these beings, is that time really for us is decay. We're winding down our mortal bodies, and then once we go into the afterlife, there is no more time because it is everlasting, eternal. In the face of the eternal, time disappears, just like a shadow disappears when there's nothing but light. So if you want to look at the aspect of how we're on this earth, then you have to understand time, or at least appreciate that time passes, because we are getting older. And so in this new year, let's think about how it is a mercy to have the gift of time at all, because otherwise we would be, by original sin, we would be like the angels who constantly are making that decision, the fallen angels, that is, to reject God. It is eternal now for them. Us, we can repent. We can, like you said, have reconciliation. So the concept of time itself is a mercy because it allows us to continue to move closer to God through reconciliation. I like the word religion, through religion, because religare, from the Latin for religion, means to bind oneself. So we are binding ourselves to the great good, to God, through our religion. And time is the gift, the mercy that allows us to continue to move towards him as we decay, as we wind down. So this is a good time to think about how can we move closer to that great good. What do you think?
I think that's great. It's a really good point, especially about the I never really, I mean, you don't often think about that, is that it's an ever-present rejection of God on the part of the demons, the fallen angels, which is really crazy to think about, because we, with our understanding of time, have this idea of decay, in that you kind of think of, at least for me, how I used to think of it, is that, the angels were good and beautiful, and then they chose evil, and then they were cast down, and over time they kind of became demons, but it's crazy to think that it's ever present for them, so that the moment that they rejected God, that rejection turned them into these hideous demons as we understand them and have experienced them.
Right.
So it's a great call and a great reminder. I think that we are called to live very much in the present, and understanding this gift of time as something that needs to be taken advantage of and used, that we live in the now, and it's important for us to be choosing the good now and to be turning towards God in all things, because the now is when it's our time. It's our only opportunity to do good.
That's right. Amen to that. Well, Peter, thank you for making time for this podcast. Everyone, we're sorry that it was a little bit short, but we're so happy to start this new year with you, and may God bless you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.